I'm Lauren Leader, CEO of All In Together. Welcome to this very special book talk that I've been looking forward to for a very long time, in part because I have been hearing about this book for a very long time. Thanks to my friendship with the amazing Rachel Vogelstein and her incredible partner, Meigan Stone. And I've been hearing her think about and talk about this book for a long time. So what we're going to do, this is the first time we've ever done a book talk for All In Together. We've done so many other kinds of programs. This feels like the perfect way to do our very first book event, and the perfect book to talk about it for so many reasons. For those of you who don't know us, All In Together is a nonpartisan women's civic education organization. We train women across America on the tools of civic and political leadership. And we've had a huge focus over the last 4 years on working with survivors, in part because of a partnership that we started with Gretchen Carlson a number of years ago, and a grant that she gave us thanks to the settlement that she came to with Roger Ailes after her sexual harassment lawsuit. She helped us bring civic leadership programming to 13 cities around the country, specifically focused on supporting women who had been survivors of workplace harassment, sexual assault, et cetera. And that program has now grown. We're in 5 cities. We've worked with thousands of women across America. And what we found in that work is that what so many survivors have in common, which we will 100% be talking about today, and is so apropos of this extraordinary book, is that wherever women have suffered, what they share is a desire to ensure that no other woman ever has to go through what they have gone through. And that drive has been at the heart of the mobilization that we've done with survivors across America, and is really at the heart of this incredible book, Awakening, co-authored by my friends Rachel Vogelstein and Meigan Stone from the Council on Foreign Relations. So we're going to talk today about the book, about what they learned around the world particularly. And I thought that was such a fascinating part of this, is that I really didn't know the extent to which the Me Too movement has triggered an avalanche of women's rights activism in so many countries around the world. And I suspect many of us on this call were not aware of what has happened around the world. So just really brief introductions. We, I think, shared them with everybody who's attending. The order of operations here is I'm going to chat for about 25 minutes or so with Rachel and Meigan, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. You're welcome to put questions or comments into the chat, but when we start Q&A, we're going to ask you to raise your hand, and our moderator will call on you and let you unmute your phone so that you can actually ask the question. We'd also just ask that you introduce yourself when you do ask that question, and share any affiliation that you might have. So Rachel Vogelstein is the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow and Director of the Women in Foreign Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. She worked for Secretary Hillary Clinton on women's issues, worked during the Obama administration. She served as a member of the White House Council on Women and Girls and the Office of Global Women's Issues. I have had the privilege of getting to know her through the council and the amazing work at the Women in Foreign Policy Program. And Meigan Stone was president of the Malala Fund from 2014 to 2017, which is just one of the most extraordinary organizations in the world. And all you have to do is say Malala, and women everywhere have a moment. She is also a senior fellow at the Women in Foreign Policy Program at the Council, and she writes on women and human rights topics for multiple publications. She was a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School and serves on the boards of Indivisible, speaking of political activism, Indivisible, and Congressman John Lewis's Faith and Politics Initiative. So welcome, Rachel and Meigan. Thanks for taking time in this week of your book publication.
Thank you for having us. We're so glad to be here.
So let's talk about Awakening. And, in the book, you talk about the ways in which first of all, the opening by Tarana Burke, which is so riveting and powerful. And actually, I'm not sure that I even really understood the full picture of how the concept of Me Too, the hashtag that we all know, how that came to be. And she tells this incredible story of having listened to a survivor and just felt so compelled to say something. And that it was, in fact, that those words, Me Too, that were so transformative in her connection with this young survivor that she was handling. But I don't think most of us really understood we've seen the extraordinary transformation that's happened in the United States. I would certainly argue that hasn't gone far enough, which we can talk about. But I really didn't have a sense of how much this movement ignited women's activism around the world. So can you guys talk about that and how you came to understand, the power of what was happening globally and why you were so compelled to write the book? Either of you can start, either Rachel or Meigan. I defer to you guys.
Great. Well, Lauren, thank you again so much for giving us the opportunity to be with you and to talk about awakening. The genesis of the book for me really started in the aftermath of the 2016 election, an election I had worked on, hoping to elect the first woman president of this country. So in the aftermath of that election, I was really struck after kind of slumping back to my office in Washington, D.C., by this incredible rise in women's activism. And we certainly saw that here in the United States. But what really struck me was how global this rise was. And you think about the Women's March of 2017, which is the largest single-day protest on behalf of women's rights in history. It was not only in Washington, it was on every continent. And the notion that women organized digitally in just 10 weeks, transnationally, across country lines, to mobilize in masses that had never before been seen was really striking. And then, of course, we see the Me Too movement go viral later that same year and ultimately travel to over 100 countries. And then that translates into this rise in women's political activism. We saw, of course, a record number of women running for office here in that 2018 election, but we also saw it in other countries, in Afghanistan, in Brazil, in parts of the Middle East. So we were really struck by this story and saw that the US media, which had focused a fair amount on the movement here, really was missing the global dimensions. And we knew this was a story that had to be told.
Well, there was a sort of celebrity salaciousness to the way that the US covered this, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine if it hadn't been these super high profile men like Roger Ailes, like Harvey Weinstein, like Matt Lauer, these sort of folks, household names. I mean, women have been fighting these issues for decades, but it took that sort of celebrity culture for the US media to pay attention to it. Meigan, what did you see in terms of just like this sort of galvanizing call to arms around the world that was so compelling to you?
It's interesting that you point out the celebrity culture part of it, because as you were saying that, I was nodding in agreement, but I almost want to flip the script and focus our attention instead on Jodi Kantor and Meigan Twohey for breaking the Weinstein story. You could think of it as it was because Weinstein was so well known, or maybe we could also look at it as those two journalists had spent decades honing their craft and broke the story and fought for that story with their editors. And that's actually something that we saw all over the world. We interviewed journalists in places like Pakistan, where young women journalists are fighting to get these stories covered as well, or where we see similar celebrity allegations made. In Pakistan, it was a Bollywood celebrity, Misha Shafi, who's a household name there, accused another Bollywood celebrity of sexual harassment and did this on Twitter and used the Me Too hashtag and really helped bring to bear, the complaints that so many women had in Pakistan, but felt like they couldn't raise. In Nigeria, we saw women coming out against celebrity megachurch pastors in the Christian majority southern part of Nigeria, people that have tremendous influence and followings. These are church mega pastors that sometimes visiting heads of state even come and pay courtesy calls to. So, people of tremendous power and privilege. In some other countries, it may be coming out against an elected leader that's popular, or it could be an imam, that's a popular kind of teacher and preacher. And so, I think it's always about the power dynamic, right? And it's the same thing that keeps women silent. And it's also the thing that makes these allegations and charges so explosive when they are taken seriously.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the explosiveness of it, because I do think the thing that struck me in the book, and if I haven't already plugged it enough, and Rachel has it behind her, but buy one immediately. Look, what I found so fascinating is the level of personal danger that so many of the women around the world found themselves in because they chose to speak out. You chronicle this horrifying story of a young activist in Brazil who ultimately was assassinated because of her willingness to speak out against pervasive harassment and sexual assault in Brazil. And she also then wound up running for office, very unexpected, a very unlikely candidate who wound up winning in this extraordinary race, but that she was murdered. And around the world, and obviously, Meigan, you having worked for Malala, we know that around the world, when women speak out and fight back, that in many cases, they're taking their life in their hands to do so. So can you guys talk a little bit about that? Because I also think back to this global piece of this. This is something I think American women, really can't fathom. We are, for all the problems we have in this country, and clearly we have political violence here, there's no question, but I think this sort of imminent threat of the link between life and death and speaking out against gender-based violence is hard to conceive of for many of us. Can you guys talk about that?
It was striking all around the world to see the number of women who chose not to be silent about harassment and abuse, or about persistent power imbalances in the home and in the workplace in the face of unrelenting attacks. Women that we talked to who lost their jobs, who became ostracized from their families and communities. Some were imprisoned. And as you mentioned, some pay the ultimate price, and yet more women keep coming nonetheless. I think of the determination of computer science graduate Luo Zhizhi in China, who we write about, who was inspired by Me Too's viral moment in the United States to break her silence after 13 years and courageously named the professor who harassed her, thereby triggering the Me Too movement all across China. I think of the bravery of Marielle Franco from Brazil, who you mentioned, who courageously ran for office in order to help combat harassment and discrimination against women, and then pays the ultimate price when she is brazenly assassinated in broad daylight. I think of the defiance of Swedish writer Cissi Wallin, who decided to speak publicly about what happened to her and remains determined to help others, even after she was found guilty of defaming the man that she accused, despite the fact that a number of other women came forward with disturbingly similar accusations. So after meeting these women and watching this wave of activism traverse the globe, I cannot help but be hopeful about what comes next.
Meigan, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I feel like this is the space where we have to get so real with how disconnected we feel from policy realities sometimes, right? It's like, it's something you can do. You can throw around terms like gender-based violence and talk about the impact to women, but these are women who are really paying with their lives, their bodies, their careers, their safety, and this is part of why when Rachel first came up with the idea for the book, I always say I want to give credit where it's due, and asked me if I wanted to be part of it. I said yes, but as long as we can put human rights defenders, women human rights defenders front and center, and really see this as a human rights issue, and also technology, because that's part of my background too, really looking at how digital organizing made a difference. But it came out of having all these conversations with women human rights defenders, and they weren't usually the things that would happen in front of audiences. It would be when you get to know people well, and over a meal, these women would confide that they had experienced sexual assault, sexual violence, sometimes, at the hands of male family members or community leaders for speaking out, sometimes in direct punishment for daring to stand up for their rights, like women in Egypt during the 2011 uprisings. What happened in Tahrir Square? Women were systematically sexually assaulted by the authorities to try to silence them. It was a very deliberate tactic, and we see this over and over again. I would just say though, let's not make the mistake of seeing something that happens in another country and thinking it's the exotic other, and who's most likely to kill you if you are a woman, in the United States. It's an intimate partner. It's somebody that you're in relationship with. There's huge linkage between domestic violence, and it often happens when women start to decide to leave, or when they start to decide to take action to actually prosecute that abuser. So this happens all the time right here, right? It doesn't seem as extraordinary, but it's just as courageous, right? We know that when women come forward in any context, but it happens here too. Women are in serious danger here as well.
Without question. And obviously the statistics in the United States, which we talk about all the time, and again, to your point, it's easy to get numb to them. 1 in 3 women in the United States has experienced some sort of partner violence or direct gender-based violence, sexual assault. et cetera. And then the numbers of women who have been murdered by their intimate partner with guns. I recently spoke with Shannon Watts about the work they're doing around the country to try to close the loophole that enables domestic violence offenders to still access firearms. And in the states where those rights have been revoked, because we know that there's a strong correlation between domestic violence, guns, and intimate partner murder, where they have been successful in closing that loophole, you've seen those rates go down. But you're right that it is very easy to otherize all of this and to see this as a problem that is far away. I want to talk about, because you mentioned, Meigan, the human rights campaigners around the world, the women who are fighting for women's rights. I want to hear more about this, because I think it's really interesting. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the negative in all of this and feel so completely, demoralized in a sense by the vastness of the problem. But what I love about the book is that you also talk about the extraordinary progress that's happening around the world, where laws are being changed, culture is changing, maybe not necessarily in that order, but can you guys both talk about that? Maybe start with you, Meigan, just where you think there's some really interesting examples of progress politically and in terms of policy, and then Rachel, to you too.
I think it's so important, like you just said, to focus on the progress, especially when you're trying to undertake this work of systemic cultural change, like celebrate the incremental victories, right? Because like we're trying to undo, I always joke with my male colleagues, they're like, how much more are these women going to push for? And I'm like, my dudes, you've had a good deal for a long time, like since the beginning of time, like you've been rolling deep, and it's like, yeah, it's time for some
right. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg would say, until there are nine.
I know. So there's been huge victories, in all these countries, even where maybe it's against the backdrop of, huge work still to be done, or even an authoritarian regime, like someplace like Egypt, women there after the 2011 uprisings were able to at least fight to genderize the Constitution. That just means, making sure the Constitution is going to protect the equality and the rights of women. And they were able to actually change laws and get a law for the first time that prohibits sexual harassment in the workplace. And women have started to try to use it. Have those cases been difficult? They have, but they're starting to be heard, and they're starting to get some damages and actually get some attention. And that's a huge victory in that context. In Tunisia, they had a different outcome. After their revolution, women successfully got into the constitution, everything from rights to agreement to have gender parity in political parties. So now political parties in Tunisia, you have to, by law, put forward an equal slate with as many men and as many women on your party slate. And so like huge achievement. In Pakistan, women are starting to be able to get attention for cases when it comes to sexual assault and violence that never would have been heard before, ever. And they're taking to the streets, and the first time they had their own version of the Women's March. It's just called the Aurat March, and Aurat just means woman in Urdu. And like women were out in the street and even marching with the LGBT community, with transgender women in Pakistan, which is really daring work for that context. And they were doing it. They were like, we're in solidarity. So I'm seeing like tremendous progress. Even in Nigeria, pieces of legislation were able to be passed by some of the activists that we talk about in the book, like Fakriya Hashem in the northern part of Nigeria, where it is a real tough situation to be a woman. There's early forced marriage, child marriage, Boko Haram in terms of facing terrorism. And they were able to change the law that sets out the age that a girl can get married. And they are also fighting to pass more legislation, the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, which includes real measures that protect women. So even in some of the toughest places, and this is why we selected them, we wanted to show, even in some of the places that were like, these are really challenging contexts, that women still are organizing and succeeding.
Rachel, your thoughts? I love hearing about this. I talk about Tunisia all the time, by the way. Tunisia is like my test case when we go around the country. I said, did you know that in Tunisia, they have a constitutional requirement for proportional representation, and Americans like can't believe it. It's an extraordinary thing.
This is just truly a global phenomenon. We just saw remarkable progress in only 3 years. And Brazil, you mentioned the case of Marielle Franco, who is an Afro-Brazilian lesbian human rights activist who dares to run for office. She hails from the Marais Favela, which is an urban slum in the heart of Rio. And no one expects her to win political power in a country that's controlled by privileged white men. But she rides in on this wave of activism, this campaign against harassment and discrimination that had been percolating online that long predates the Me Too hashtag here in the US. And this campaign against harassment and discrimination becomes a campaign for political power, and she's elected in a landslide to everyone's surprise. You know, as you mentioned, she pays the ultimate price for her advocacy when she's assassinated, but her chief of staff told us that they thought that by killing Marielle that they buried her assassins, but instead they planted a seed. And following her killing, her murder, a record number of women, and women of color in particular, who identified with her and believed in her, decide to run for office. And women's political representation in the 2018 federal election jumps from 10 to 15%, which is remarkable progress. So there's still a long road to go in Brazil, particularly under the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, who has fought against women's rights. But Brazilian women are assuming positions of power in record numbers, and that will give them the power ultimately to transform the agenda. You know, we saw the same thing in China, not an easy place to be a human rights activist. Women there are contending not only with harassment and discrimination, but also government repression and censorship. And yet we saw young activists create digitally organized activism that goes viral online. The government attempts to crack down once they start to get traction and arrests 5 of the leaders. They're known all around the world as the Feminist Five. They're incarcerated and held for 37 days. One has a heart attack, and that obviously creates a chilling effect. But again, women didn't back down, and they ultimately won important concessions and victories. They managed to ensure that the Ministry of Education goes on to prohibit gender quotas in admissions and tighten laws related to sexual harassment. In 2015, China enacts a long-sought anti-domestic violence law. And without this activism, without women continuing to raise their voices, these changes wouldn't have happened. They're also incredibly creative in their courageous activism. Chinese women managed to circumvent the censors because of the sheer numbers of women posting. They used blockchain technology so that the posts couldn't be taken down, or they got around banned phrases like Me Too, which was banned, by posting images, an image of a rice bowl, which is pronounced me, and a bunny, which is pronounced too. And this ends up becoming the biggest threat to the Chinese authoritarian government that it's seen since the pro-democracy protests in the late 1980s. So one of the points that we make in the book is that women's movements actually have the power to undermine authoritarian governments: China, Iran, Philippines, Russia, Turkey. So we really ought to be investing more in women who show that they know how to organize and they know how to fight back.
So a couple of things. First of all, I have chills. Like, I literally have chills listening to this. It's so extraordinary. I've been thinking a lot about, as you talk about the democracy movements and the point you just made, now in Russia with Navalny in prison, it's Navalny's wife and this huge sort of swell of women activists in Russia that are continuing to push forward. His daughter as well, right?
How cool is that?
Yeah, no, it's amazing, but also like sort of underreported. I mean, there've been these sort of like small stories about, how but they're sort of dismissive in a way of the extraordinary power that she now has in leading this democracy movement in Russia. I do want to take a minute, and I want to just say to everyone listening, you should get your questions ready because we'll pivot to that in a couple of minutes. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the internet and sort of social media. My good friend Lucina D'Ameco, who I think you guys may know, has been writing a lot about what women around the world who run for office, who step up to lead, face in terms of harassment, bullying, threats, et cetera, on social media. There's been much written about that in terms of even just the way members of Congress, and particularly in the US, members of Congress of color, the level of threats that they experience. I've experienced it. I'm a local elected official in my town. I've had to have security come to my house because of threats that I received on social media. It does feel like this push-pull of social media, right? On the one hand, such an extraordinary tool for organizing, for mobilizing women en masse, which it clearly has been, and the power of that and the way in which women's stories are transmitted through social media. On the other hand, it can also be a tool for inciting violence and, repressive behavior. And so I wonder where the two of you, how the two of you square that circle in this work, that it really is this sort of, two sides of the same coin, both the positive and the negative. So just would love to hear your thoughts on this and how you're seeing women deal with both of those factors around the world.
Say that I think we know, it's like real time online. Guess what? People show up. It's like people that want to shut you down in real time are going to be right there online too. And that's what, all the activists we talked to told us. One of the activists we write about in Pakistan, Meigan, her organization is called the Digital Rights Foundation, that she runs day in and day out, in addition to taking on pro bono cases to try to help women, prosecute cases of sexual harassment and assault, and advising Misha Shafi on her legal Me Too case. So I'm a busy woman, but that is one of the major things that she's pushing on, is she wants to try to protect women from digital harassment. And it's real. And these are credible threats, and it also intersects with authoritarianism, and that it creates another avenue to have surveillance, to have all of your engagement, whether it's legal or not, tracked and tried to use against you. People will alter images that are screenshots of your tweets or your social media posts to try to make you look like, you're not an honorable woman, or, you're doing something that, is illegal or illicit. It really runs the gamut. And, I think this just speaks to the fact, at least in the government surveillance and the government control, that, any authoritarian, totalitarian regime is going to see any effective organizing as a threat, right? And so they see women's organizing as just that, as something that they have to extinguish. And so I think it's real, but all the activists that we've talked to, they've all made the decision to do this work. All of them had to reach a point of decision where they were willing to take on the risk. And, it's a choice that most of us will never make, and I always was really affected by that with Malala. She always said her family, when they were in Swat Valley, when the Taliban took over their town and shut the girls' schools down, that they had a choice to either remain silent and get killed, or speak out and then get killed. And they had a family meeting and they decided they would choose the latter. They were going to speak out, and I feel like that's what you see over and over again with the activists that we profile in this book. They've been arrested, they've been threatened, their families have been threatened. Even some of the Pakistani activists that we write about were WhatsApping me over the weekend saying that some of the organizers of the Arat March, the Women's March, have had to go into hiding because of the persecution that they've experienced. But they've all decided to do this work nonetheless. And so, we really argue they're deserving of resources, of support. They deserve our partnership, and for us to take their lead on what they need.
Rachel?
Everything that Meigan said, I agree with and found in all of the countries that I traveled to as well. But it really is a double-edged sword. For every negative story we can tell about how women are tracked, harassed, defamed online, there are so many more stories where 21st century tools have been positive, have transformed the methods and the speed of the global women's movement. During earlier eras, victories were only won after lifetimes of organizing. It took more than a century for women globally to win the right to vote. It took decades to enshrine women's rights as human rights into international law. Today, thanks to these new technologies, the movement can mobilize millions and millions of women in a matter of weeks or even days. And we believe these tools have also diversified the global women's movement, granting purchase to anyone with access to an internet connection and helping women find strength in numbers. We argue that the internet has become a 21st century public square for women, particularly in places where their freedom is circumscribed and they can't gather safely in public, but they can post anonymously online. So the result of these tools, there are many challenges, but we also have a global women's movement that's more diverse, more powerful, and more far-reaching than at any point in history.
How thrilling. That's really an amazing thing to hear and really extraordinary. So I'm going to open it up. I can keep talking to you too forever. I'm going to open it up for questions, and I will if you have questions, you can raise your hand and Kira or Caroline will call on you. This is your chance to ask all kinds of things. While we're waiting for people to think about questions, I would like to talk for a minute about the US and what your thoughts are, and both of you are very immersed in the gender policy world at home as well. As you think about, we certainly had this very high profile moment in terms of justice around sexual assault in the Cosby case, and the sort of shock of our system having worked and not worked somehow at the same time. And obviously it does feel like in some ways now, some of the swiftness of the backlash, the Me Too response has dulled. That we have, for example, Andrew Cuomo still in office, having not resigned despite many accusations against him, and the sort of slowing down of the wheels around that, the call for an independent investigation, et cetera. You've got, accusations against other prominent men that seem not to be resulting in the swift kind of takedown that it did a few years ago. But I'm wondering how you're thinking about that and the sort of Me Too moment now, and where we are in the United States. I think we did have one question, but let's finish this and then we'll go to the questions.
We actually wrote a Washington Post op-ed about this, where essentially we argue that evaluating the strength of the global women's movement, the Me Too movement, only through the lens of consequences on one famous American man would be a mistake. And we know that in the case of Bill Cosby, that case was flipped on a procedural technicality, not because the more than 60 women who came forward weren't believed. But we also see that we need policy change. There are too many instances in which women still do not have access to justice. And in the book, we outline an agenda to help turn protest into progress. And we've come to refer to it as the 5 R's, which are redress for survivors, reform of the law, representation for women, resources for implementation, and a recalibration of social norms. And the first R I mentioned, redress or justice for survivors, it's at the top of the list of almost every Me Too activist that we interviewed. For centuries, people accused of sexual abuse, especially those with the most power, have had the legal system tipped in their favor, while the reputations and integrity of survivors have been put on trial. And this injustice helps explain why, before the Me Too movement offered both anonymity and strength in numbers, that so few women were willing to come forward to name what was plainly happening all around us. So delivering justice for survivors requires legal reform. It requires a functioning and balanced legal system, one that, yes, protects the rights of the accused, but that also protects the rights of survivors and is free from discrimination and stereotypes about women.
Well, and I would say that I think obviously the reform of the system is critical, but also so is the ongoing social norms, right, which continue to question the veracity of women's claims, their intentions in making them, et cetera. So we have one question from Alice Dahl, which I will read. So women in Afghanistan, and apropos, because Rachel was speaking about this on Morning Joe earlier this week, women in Afghanistan have made tremendous progress in claiming their rights over the past decade. They're in danger of losing much of what they've gained as the US and NATO pull out, leaving a vacuum the Taliban are quickly acting to fill. Our US government is trying to protect interpreters and others who were useful to the US military, but women human rights defenders, journalists, judges, and educators are feeling abandoned. How can we as American activists provide effective support and solidarity with the courageous women activists in Afghanistan? Alice, thanks for that fantastic question.
I'm happy to start, and I know Meigan has a lot to say on this topic too. It's really critical that the Biden administration advocate for the meaningful participation of women in every process in Afghanistan. The situation on the ground, as we've all been reading, is incredibly fraught. It's particularly dangerous for women who have been under sustained assault. But just as the Me Too movement and the rise of women's voices has helped transform social norms in so many places around the world, so too in Afghanistan, we see a different country than it was 20 or 30 years ago. There's a constitution, girls have returned to school, women are in the workplace. That is the Afghanistan of today. And so for this country to function effectively, women's fundamental rights cannot and should not be taken away. We hear that folks in the Biden administration are indeed focused on the safety and security of women in this transition, which quite frankly, they need to be. The administration needs to ensure financial support and assistance to women's organizations on the ground. They need to provide safety for women who have bravely been fighting against the Taliban and who are most at risk, and that includes visas. And they need to include women in conflict resolution processes, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's strategic, because doing so will advance the long-term stability of the country and the region. Meigan, I know you have a lot to say too.
Yeah, I know. I've been really grateful to work with a lot of the different women activists from Afghanistan, obviously also working in Pakistan because they share a border. And of course, it's just a lesson that elections matter. Here, the reality is like, we can have all the policy prescriptions we want now, but we already gave away the farm in the negotiation, right? Anything that we could have done when we started the pullout of American forces to ensure women's rights, like the previous administration simply didn't do. They could not have cared less, and I think you saw that in how they handled the negotiations. And I think it's a real tough slog for the Biden administration to pick this up now. They were left a tremendously challenging situation where all the leverage was already given away, right? So I think the visa question is a critical one. And then just continuing, I think making it easier to support women there. Right now, there's a lot of challenges to move money into places like Afghanistan to help women's organization. There's a lot of red tape. There's also a lot of red tape around visas. If women human rights defenders are in grievous danger, we need to be able to help them, just like the interpreters, that have been in the news a lot. We need to do a better job at making it easier to help people that have real credible fear leave, especially if it's because they, worked with US forces or, received funding from USAID and, now are being targeted. But, truly to be a woman right now who's a journalist or a leader in Afghanistan, your life is in danger, period. And I think this just speaks to how little the needs of women are considered in conflict resolution, at the peacemaking table. Even though we find that like women are involved, like the peace is more durable, it's more equitable, but time and time again, women's concerns, women's safety, are just considered collateral damage to conflict, and that has to shift.
I got to do two shout outs. I mean, one, in a sense, to the incredible work that both of you have done, but especially under Secretary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, because so much of the agenda, her agenda at that time, which I came to understand really through you, Rachel, and my time at the CFR, was really was about that, about the power that women have as stabilizers of democracy. And I think it is part of the Afghanistan story that still remains overlooked. And a lot of credit it should be given to First Lady Laura Bush and the work that she did in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, working with civil society leaders, encouraging women leaders in the country. We're very lucky that her former chief of staff, Charity Wallace, who was very deeply involved in that work on the ground in Afghanistan, is on our board. And it's just, I think it's part of this sort of like underappreciated story of the stabilization of both Afghanistan and Iraq, which is the role that women played there. We got another really fantastic and interesting question from Susan Connolly. Would appreciate if you would speak a bit to Indigenous women in the United States and Canada and elsewhere, standing up for their rights and seeking justice for crimes of the past. It's wonderful that we finally have an Indigenous woman as Interior Secretary, but obviously, this horrifying stories of the deaths of Indigenous children that have been uncovered in Canada, and that certainly Indigenous women in the United States have spoken about for years and never were really taken seriously. Deb Haaland, some of you may know, is the first Interior Secretary, not just to be as a Native American, but to launch an inquiry into the abuse of Native children. Can you guys speak to this? It does feel like an extraordinarily timely question. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, I'm so grateful to answer this one because I am myself of Choctaw background, Mississippi Choctaw, and I'm very proud of that and work a lot with Indigenous women activists. And I was actually going to mention earlier when you asked about the US, the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement in the United States is yet another example of how vulnerable populations do not get access to justice. You know, there's a huge issue with women disappearing from reservation lands and from being found, you know, killed and the victim of sexual violence. Often those crimes are not investigated in a comprehensive or timely manner. And so I think this is also another example of how digital organizing can work. There's been huge increases in visibility of the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement and campaign because they can organize digitally, because women can organize online across different tribal groups and come together and try to call attention. You know, like a red dress or a red ribbon skirt is another symbol of the MMIW movement. And, you know, I've been grateful to participate in marches on Native lands, on tribal land, trying to call attention to that with the authorities that could change it. But in terms of the boarding school issue, like this is something that it's shocking to me that the whole world's figuring this out now. If you spend any time on a reservation or with a tribal community, everybody has a family member that was an uncle, a grandfather, a grandmother that experienced the horror of, you know, the tribal boarding school system where children were taken from their parents and put into, you know, anglicized, westernized, usually Christian run, you know, schools and taken from their communities, told they were forbidden to speak their language. When I write my tribe, the Choctaw, to get Choctaw language studies, I get back the material that was actually given to children in those boarding schools. That was the Choctaw dictionary that I received when my grandfather started teaching me some words in the Choctaw language. I got that. It was the same material that was used to really rip culture away from these children. So, you know, I'd say it's overdue that Indigenous women are leading. And there's actually a really amazing group of Indigenous women who are starting to run for office at the local level, inspired by people like Deb. I think of Ruth Anna Buffalo in North Dakota. She's Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, and she's in the state house and just passed legislation requiring that children in North Dakota, which, by the way, so much Indian land there, it's truly Indian country, now have to study Indigenous history as part of their curriculum. So I could go on forever. As you can tell, I care a lot about the issue.
Amazing. No,
I'm so glad for the question and that it even came up. That's the first time we've actually been asked about that and talking about the book. And so it means a lot to me that someone even asked that. So thank you.
It's riveting. And I think and Susan Connolly says, thank you. Great to hear. And Susan, that was such a great question. Thank you. Look, it's a riveting piece of this picture here and in Canada and in other places, because it does go to this very core issue of just believing women, like even just being willing to hear this. And, you know, I think that's what's so shocking, you know, as a white American, to realize that in these communities that women have been speaking about this for generations and have been ignored. And it is the extraordinary power of representation, right? To have someone like Deb Haaland in that position, which is way more than symbolic. It really is more than that. So I think we have time for one last question from AJ Conroy. Changing laws and constitutions of countries was mentioned. That's also needed in the United States to close I think there's a typo here, but Virginia was the 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment in 2020, a bright spot in that dumpster fire of a year. Now that there is an AG lawsuit to recognize the 28th Amendment and a resolution stuck in the Senate, would updating the United States Constitution position the US to influence policy around the world? Or just underline that we're behind? Amy Jo from Illinois. Oh, Amy, ERA speaks to my soul. So I am the daughter, my mother is on this call. My mother worked on ERA for many, many, many years. So I'd love to hear what you guys feel about this. I personally feel that it is an extraordinarily heavy boulder to be rolling up a hill right now, but I'd love to hear what you guys think about this, about the importance of ERA relative to other fights, et cetera.
In the book, in our prescription for action, one of the R's that we include in the agenda is reform of the laws. And we recognize that, you know, just as the civil rights era Birmingham bus boycott was part of pushing back on a larger system of racial inequality, the Me Too movement has been taking on broader structural barriers that fuel gender inequality. And it's this power imbalance between the genders that is often enshrined in law that creates the conditions for the harassment and abuse that we've been talking about to flourish. So the bottom line is we do need legal reform. there are 100 countries around the world that still have laws on the books that impede women's participation in the workplace. And you may be familiar with many of those restrictions on women's right to travel freely, to own and inherit property, to serve as head of household. And obviously the situation is different here in the United States, but it does matter and it does make a difference. I'm a lawyer by training, and there are still pieces of the legislation that's been passed in the past on the books, court decisions that still apply, that treat men and women differently under the law, related to age of consent and sexuality, related to women's participation in the military and the requirement that men only register for the draft, for the selective service system here in the United States. There's law in good standing on the books that hasn't been changed. And there's also this symbolic message that is sent by having a clear statement of gender equality in our most important document, our Constitution. Many other constitutions around the world now have gender equality written in. And the fact that we don't is really a gap. There's also our voice on the international stage. The fact that we haven't ratified ERA, and importantly, that we haven't ratified the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, not only affects the rights of women here in the United States, but it also compromises our ability to support those around the world who are using tools like CEDAW, who would look to the US Constitution in fighting for their own rights. So it does make a difference. There are still inequalities, while certainly not at the same level as we see in laws in countries around the world. But there's also this symbolic message of our voice on the world stage. And Lauren, as you rightly point out, there's clearly a long road to go in Congress, but we've seen remarkable change in record time. What seems impossible in one generation is the reality in the next. I think about an issue like domestic violence. 25 years ago, there were only 5 countries that classified domestic violence as a crime. It was considered a family matter. And today, more than 150 countries have laws criminalizing domestic violence on the books. So while more work is needed to implement them, the law does matter. It drives social norms. And I hope that we'll get to the point where we can say that not only have we ratified ERA, but we've also ratified CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women.
I love that. And I've learned so much I attended a forum at CFR recently about CEDAW, which I didn't really know that much about. And I was so fascinated by it. I thought it was riveting. And, I think I will say on the US front, I can say this in our small group, but, I have heard quietly that, many of us have been very frustrated that the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, was not reauthorized in the last Congress, that it had fallen off. And in fact, one of the issues that has prevented it from being ratified again, 2 of them, one is about autonomy on native lands, which has been part of, one of the issue stumbling blocks, and the other is around the rights of trans and LGBT Americans to have the same protections under the law that women had previously in VAWA legislation. But I am told that there is a very quiet bipartisan effort underway in the Senate to try to reauthorize VAWA. And I'm hopeful we'll be watching it and we'll be sharing it back with our network, because I think it is such a critical piece. There's one last comment, which I think is really fabulous and worth saying, and maybe a great place to close. So Paul Brighton shared, I think we need to be having a simultaneous conversation on redefining what it means to be a boy and a man in a world that seeks to uplift women. And I think that is right, that we, do have to continue to explore and focus on the conditions that are leading men to perpetrate violence against women, to view themselves as, immune from consequences for their behavior towards women, for the persistent social norms that continue to perpetuate inequality. Do you guys want to speak to that for a minute? Because there is no solution without the accountability and the transformation of the behavior of men here and around the world.
I feel like this speaks to a couple things in the book for us. One is recalibration of these gender roles, like, Rachel was sharing about earlier. It's that we need to have discussions across the board about this and like what needs to shift. And I think also taking into account, you know, where applicable, restorative justice approach, you know, this may be more fitting for the United States than in some of the countries, for example, that I write about, where it's hard to start to talk about restorative justice when there's just no justice for women on these issues. You know, so instead of moving directly to alternative means, they would like to have at least a guarantee of due process and protection under the law to start, which still has not been achieved. You know, but is there a space to bring everyone along? Like, is there space for recovery from some of these ideas? Is there space for making amends? Is there space for taking responsibility and learning a different way? I actually, for my author's dedication, wrote it. I am a single mom. I have one child who is a little boy, and I dedicated the book to him. I said to my son, as he learns to be a new man, and I meant a boy becoming a man and hopefully learning to be a new man. I mean, I don't know about everyone on this call, but at the beginning of the pandemic, I hit the wall as a single mom because I was doing my 3 meals a day. I was trying to work. I was running virtual school. I was trying to keep us all together. And I actually sat my son down at the ripe age of 10. And I just said to him, I was like, baby, I love you. And it's my privilege to be your mama. But there's a lot of things that women do and we do it with a lot of love. And so it's invisible. And like, what I need you to know is it's not, it needs to be visible. I need you to do what's appropriate for you as a young man to help with the house. Like, you can unload the dishwasher. Sometimes you can make yourself lunch. I'm going to start teaching you how to do laundry. And like I said to him, I was like, I refuse to raise a young man who becomes a man who doesn't know how to do these things, who doesn't know what it takes to run a family or a home. These are your responsibilities too. But I have so many friends here in the United States that didn't have that conversation, right? You know, when I think of the women in Nigeria that we wrote about, they're doing really inspiring work around consent. It's like they're going into classrooms with both girls and boys, because it's important to say out loud, boys experience sexual assault and men experience sexual harassment as well. But they go in and teach consent, you know, and this is in Kaduna State in northern Nigeria, you know, talking to children about your body and that you get to agree if people touch you and this is yours, you know, and so like they're trying to change the next generation. And I know Tarana talks about that all the time. She dreams of a world where, you know, this isn't even an issue anymore. This just becomes acceptable and known and agreed. And so let's hope for that to be true. But I don't know, Rachel, what would you want to add?
Let's give Rachel, we'll give Rachel the second to last word, and the last word, and then I'll close. But yeah, and good for you, Meigan. Yes, I think we all would like to have men in our lives that have been compelled to see their role as critical instead of just as being served.
It's such an important point that the questioner raised. And, you know, people often ask us, who we've been talking to about the book, what they can do. And we really have 2 prescriptions for action. The first, of course, is to support the women in the organizations leading the change that we write about. And there's actually a section in the book where we list all of them and provide their websites so that you can go ahead and do that. But the second thing we say, which relates to the question, is challenge harmful and discriminatory norms that you hear espoused by family and friends. When you hear jokes or stereotypes about the truthfulness of women who come forward about sexual abuse, challenge those. If you hear people questioning the likability or relatability of women seeking positions of power, challenge them, challenge yourself, because shifting attitudes about sexual abuse and women's leadership is really critical to addressing this broader power imbalance that we write about, in which sexual abuse and harassment flourishes.
So I am so deeply grateful for the work that you both have done, are doing, did do with this book, which I think is indispensable. Don't take my word for it. Hillary Clinton tweeted it this week. She also writes one of the lovely blurbs for the book and gave it her massive personal endorsement. But, you know, look, I have found it so profoundly moving and inspiring and motivating to understand the huge challenges that women are facing around the world, their willingness to do hard things, to push back, to put their lives and their livelihoods and their selves on the line in order to fight not just for themselves, but for all women. And in this country where we're so privileged, most of us, with a basic level of safety and security, you know, that we look to those women as inspirations and realize that this is a lifetime, that our fight for our rightful place of equity in our society and in all societies is a lifetime. it is the work of all of our lives. And I'm so grateful for both of you for shining a light and for showing us the way. And to everyone who came on today, we'll have this available on our website. So please feel free to share it with others who weren't able to be here. And, just a huge thank you to you both.
Thank you so much for having us. We're really grateful.
Buy the book. Go buy several copies for your friends and family.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your community for supporting us. We appreciate it so much.
Our pleasure. Great to be with you.